Welcome to Let's Make a Game Platformer, episode 26. In last episode, I've finished working on the projectiles being shot by the new enemy. And in this episode, I'd like to do something different. Doing the same thing for a long time gets a bit boring, so I like to jump around a bit and do different things on different days. So in this episode, I'd like to improve the loading and unloading of the levels. And the way I'd like to do is basically add some transitions. So at the moment when I start a new game, when I click the button, it jumps immediately into the game. It's kind of a sudden. The same happens when I move to next level, which is something I'd like to avoid. So my idea is to add fade to black, like very short period of time after the whatever event happens that triggers moving to a different area, like death, for example, and then so fade to black, and then whenever the level gets loaded again, I want to fade from black to the actual level scene. So the way I'd like to do this is to use post-processors. There is a couple of post-processors already available in the gaming package here. One of them is color tint post-processor, which uses color tint component that specifies the color of the that you want to overlay on the scene, how big the impact of the color should be on the scene. So from 0 being no impact at all to 1 being this is going to be a completely opaque color on the scene, and also whether this effect should be applied before or after UI is being drawn. So you might imagine in some cases you want to darken something before UI is drawn. For example, when you want to simulate a night, or this is just a simple example, and then UI you would expect the UI to be like normally drawn. Alternatively, you can go for doing the darkening or adding more color or specific tinting of with some red color, green, or whatever you choose. You might want to have it after the UI is being drawn. For example, in this case, when I'll be doing fade to black and fade from black, I will be doing it in the after UI is drawn, so that you don't see the UI immediately when you switch. It just slowly fades into the vision along with the rest of the scene. Okay, since this component is something that is used by the processor to actually apply the change to the frame, a particular frame being rendered. However, we need something that will allow us to modify basically this factor going from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0, depending whether we want to fade to black or fade from black, fade in or fade out. So I need a new component that basically will say, okay, this entity at the moment will have this component modified from time X to time Y, from factor X to factor Y. Since at the moment I will be doing this only for the gameplay, so from the game scene. However, you can imagine that when the menu is being displayed and I click a new button, you would want to fade out probably the main menu screen as well. So this is going to be common between both gameplay and menu. That's why I'll create here a package called common. And in here, I'll create a package transition. Is it transition or transitions? No, we used singular. Okay, so transition. Okay, so I'll add here a new component for specifying that this entity has to have the tinting modified over time. Color tint transition component. It extends component, and we'll have start time, length, factor from, and factor to, and setters for all of them. All right, so we have these here. Now what I need to do is to modify the rendering entity that we use for the scene and add the color tint component to it. We'll go for black for now. Well, probably we'll stay at that. And maybe just to show how it works for the time being, I'll say factor 0.5. And what was the last one? Post UI. Maybe I'll start with false to show you the effect of this. So what this one change had actually done to the scene. So first we'll begin adding the black color overlay before the UI is drawn. As you can see now, it's much darker here, but the UI itself is still like vibrant as it was before. And when I change this to true, you can see that the whole scene is darker, but also the UI. Okay, and this is the effect we want to go for. However, we want to start with 0, saying that the color is not visible at all, and there will be no processing done at all for this entity, for this rendering. Okay, so now we have to add a system that will be basically applying the transition component, modifying the color tint based on the transition component definition. So :tint transition system. And I'll be using a time manager here to figure out what time is it. And I will be doing this in an update event. Okay, update and entity ref. And I will be iterating over all the entities that have these two components. So I have to create an index on entities. So I will need entity index manager. And I'll create an index on these two. So color tint component and color tint transition component. Tint transition entities. Okay, so in here I'll go through all the entities that have these two components. I don't need this part because I've modified the entity index to be iterable. Okay, the system. Okay, so I iterate through them. Also, I get a time. And so what I have to do here is figure out what's the factor that we have to apply. So let's go with float factor. And let me extract these two components from the entity. Color tint component and color tint transition component. So if tint transition, or maybe I'll extract first all the values from tint transition, because I'll be using them multiple times. So start time, length, factor from, and factor to. Okay, so now if start time is less than time, so we're not supposed to start the transition, the factor will be factor from, so the starting point. Otherwise, if start time plus length is less than time, that means we are already after the transition has been done, then after or at the time of the transition, then start time equals time, and this. Okay, so this means that the time for the transition has passed. So what we want to do is set the factor is equal factor 2, and I want to remove the color tint transition component, because I don't want this to be called again. So transition has been finished, we can remove it safely. Okay, and otherwise we'll between the start time and end time, so start time plus length time. So the factor will be factor from plus, and now we have to figure out where we are in the time of the transition. So start time minus time divided by length. And this has to be multiplied by the difference between factor 2 and factor from. Okay, and now finally apply the factor to the tint component and save the entity. Okay, that's it. Now we have to figure out where we want to add this. So one place where we are controlling all the state change, so loading a level or unloading it, player dies, and so on, is this game state switcher class. Sorry, not gameplay state system. So in here we are actually already doing stuff when level is loaded, when level is unloaded, and so on. And we'll have to also modify that. For example, when player dies, we don't immediately set this value here. Instead, we will set it after we apply here the fade to black, and when the fade to black is finished, we will actually set this value to true. So let's start with that maybe. So if you remember from the last episode, whenever you wanted to do something, schedule some kind of event to happen, I was using delay manager, and I will use it here as well. So whenever player dies, in the delay manager, rather than setting the player that equals true, I want to add delayed action on the entity, and action will be player dead, and let's go for delay of, so 200 milliseconds is going to be the time for, let me modify it, fade duration. Okay, so when a player has died, rather than setting this value here, I will just schedule this event to be called. So in here, I also need to receive an event. Delayed action. And if action ID equals to player dead, I want to set this. Okay, so now we have this, but we also have to add the component for fade to black. So we will need the rendering entity provider to get the entity to that you want to apply this to, to add the fade to black stuff. So rendering entity, and we want to create component color tint transition. And in here we also need time to specify when we want to start. So start time will be transition set start time is time manager get time, so current time. Transition length will be fade duration. And we want to go from 0, so there is no impact of the color tint, all the way to 1, so completely opaque, so completely opaquely black, because that's the color we have specified in the rendering entity. And finally, I need to save the changes to the rendering entity. So let me extract this to a method. Fade to black. Awesome. And so the same has to happen for level completed. So when level is completed, I want to fade to black, and I want to schedule an action on the entity level completed fade duration. And when the level, let's call it level finished. So it's going to be the same as the here. So else if event get action ID equals level finished, we'll set this. And when level is loaded, we want to fade from black. So what we do here is we'll copy this method to have fade. Let's call it fade in. Sorry, this is fade out. So when level is completed, we want to fade out. When level is loaded, we want to fade in. And delay manager add delayed action entity level loaded. Level loaded. Okay. Level finished is false and player dead is false. Okay, this looks good, I think. Let's test it. So when level starts, we have a bug. Okay, so actually there was a couple of issues I found. So first of all, this condition is incorrect. So we should be doing if we are before start time or at the start time. So if we are before the start time, that the factor is the factor that we are going from. If we are after the end time, this is end time, then you want to do this operation. Otherwise, we want to do this. In here, there's also a bug. We should be doing the opposite. That's because time, when we get here, time is always after start time, and we want to have a positive number coming from this part. Okay, so this is the first two problems, and second problem is that when I was doing the fade in, I want to go from 1 to 0, from completely opaque to completely no impact on the scene. I've also modified it to 1000 milliseconds just to show the effect better. I'll just modify it in a moment because this 1 second is going to be definitely way too long. And so let's see how it works. Okay, so we have fade in, and here's going to be a bug. Yeah, I'm aware of this bug and why this happens, and this is something that I'll fix now. So the problem is in this class that we are, so when, for example, player level is completed, we are doing a fade out. However, level is completed whenever player overlays the exit portal. The thing is that even though the level is completed and we wait for, let's change it to 200 milliseconds back. For the 200 milliseconds, on the next frame, next game loop update, we will get this event being fired once again because player 1 still is overlapping the game exit. So what we want to do is to be able to say, okay, we no longer care about this event. So the way we do this is in the hitbox system. We'll check whether we are interested in whether all the systems in our context are okay with sending this event that something is overlapping, or even checking if something is overlapping. So the way we can do this is saying hitbox entities, and I'll add a new system here. So this is similar to the physics we had here. Should entity move? We'll have here should entity hitbox overlap. It's an event, not entity ref. And maybe fix the spelling. Okay, should entity overlap, and we'll send the event here. And we'll send it to the hitbox entity entity send overlap. And if, okay, so we want to be able to cancel it. And get the value as well. So if it's not cancelled, then we do this, then we check the overlaps for it. That's one thing. And another thing is we have one more place where we check overlaps like that, which is the death bounce check system. And in there we also do similar, so we'll have a new event here. Should death bounce check. Which is going to be also, let's just copy the stuff, it's going to be the same. And we will send the player entity here. So player entity, should death bounce check. And player entity will send it to it. If it's not cancelled, we'll perform the checks. So in the system here, that actually is steering the flow of the game between levels and death and so on, we have to check whether we allow these two checks to be done on the player or not. So I'll introduce a new flag here. Allow bounce checks. By default, it's going to be true. And in here, we'll have two new event listeners. Hitbox check allowed. And we want to have another player comp, something that has a player. And if it's not allowing bounce check, we should be canceling the event. And similarly for the death bounce check. Death bounce check allowed. Should death bounce check. If doesn't allow bounce checks, event cancel. And so I have to now set these values, and I'll set them here. No, it's called allow bounds check. So when player dies, we no longer want to allow checks. And the same when the level is completed. And when level is loaded, we want to reset this flag back to what it was at the beginning. So yes, we want to allow checking all the hit overlaps. So let's run it now and see if both dying and switching from level to level works with the fading in and out. So we fade into the level, and there's a problem. Okay, so the problem was actually a bit more complicated. However, it was resolved already, and what was left is that these two values, whenever level is loaded, we want to set them immediately rather than when after a delay. That's because level is loaded immediately, and otherwise we will have the game state switcher that is running in the main menu context will be progressing to next levels immediately because it thinks the level was already finished. Okay, so we don't need this part. We don't need to schedule this change, and this part is not needed. So now if I run it, we got fading into the game, fade out and fade in into next level. When I die, fades out and fade in the same level. When I die on this enemy, everything is happening fine. And when I die for the last time, we get to the main menu. Probably we should do similar here, that when player run out of lives, rather than do it immediately, we should also schedule the delay. We don't need to fade out because the fade out is going to be done during the player being dead, which is done here, fade out. But when it runs out of lives, we want to schedule a player without lives. Player without lives. Okay, so now when I die enough times, it should be fading out to black and then moving back to the main menu. And the last one, fade to black and main menu. Okay, that's it for this episode. Make sure to like it and subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on Twitter. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching. Bye.